Moscow has warned of consequences for the UK after it was confirmed that British-made drones were used in recent Ukrainian strikes on Russia. So what could those consequences be, and just how involved is the UK in this conflict? We will try and answer those questions on this episode of the BBC's Daily News podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex in the Westminster studio.
And shortly we're going to speak to our colleague Dan Johnson, who's our new Ukraine correspondent, because today the Russian embassy in the UK has warned that there will be, quote, consequences for Britain because British-made drones, the Russians allege, have been used in some of the Ukrainian attacks inside Russia in the last couple of days. So to help me and Alex untangle that, we are joined now by Dan Johnson, who's in Kyiv. Hi, Dan.
Hi there, good afternoon.
And back at Westminster, it's Alex Forsyth. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Adam.
Right. Before we get into sort of the politics and the diplomacy, Dan, can you just give us a bit of a sit rep about how the conflict is looking this week? Just sort of do a bit of a map for us.
Yeah, there's been another round of intense attacks by both sides, particularly bad for Ukrainians over the past 24 hours. 17 people were killed, 10 of them in one double Russian missile strike in Kharkiv in the northeast. Over the weekend, there were more deaths and a strike on a marketplace that was particularly upsetting to a lot of people in Kyiv. It was a second-hand bookstall and a place that people would go for collectible records and bric-a-brac, that sort of thing. The place I actually was the week before, browsing through those stalls, and then there they were 1 week later, totally destroyed. People had been injured there, but also their individual personal businesses had gone up in smoke, totally destroyed. And people asking the question, why is Russia doing this? It says it's targeting military sites. Why would something like that be hit? The Ukrainians have been launching more long-range drone strikes into Russia. They're claiming success in targeting the oil refineries, the transport network, but particularly the Wildberries online retail warehouses. And every night there seems to be another one of those burning. But I've been talking to the deputy director of Ukraine's intelligence service, who told me that he thought those strikes were justified in the first instance because he said they were disrupting supplies to the Russian military. But also he said that was having an effect, the intelligence shows, in influencing how strongly the Russian people feel against this war. He said you can't really describe that as organized opposition yet, but he thought it was hardening public resolve in questioning the Kremlin strategy and whether they would ever succeed in this war.
And Dan, do we have any idea which of those Ukrainian attacks inside Russia were conducted using British-made drones?
No, we've not had that sort of detail. We knew that Britain was going to supply drones to the Ukrainians. That was announced earlier this year. Ukrainians had said that they were using those drones, but it was only at the weekend that we got confirmation from British sources that drones made by two British companies, one of them BAE Systems, the other one hasn't been named because of the fear that they may now be the target of Russian reprisals. So we know that over the past few months, we don't know how many, but those drones have played a part in the repeated waves of Ukrainian attacks across Russia. And the Prime Minister said that he accepts this despite the angry response from the Russians. He said this is part of the UK doing what it can to support the Ukrainians in those strikes. Hundreds of drones are launched every night by the Ukrainians, nearly 1,000 on the biggest night of those attacks. We don't know the numbers. The contribution is actually potentially quite small in terms of how many the UK has provided, but it's the sort of support that Ukraine relies upon and is grateful for and is calling for more of.
Well, yeah, because Dan, I remember a few months ago when Keir Starmer was Prime Minister, in fact, it was back in January this year, there was, and I've just got it here on my laptop, a press release called UK Industry Support to Ukraine Supercharged with New Business Centre. And it's about opening a new facility to produce more of these octopus drones. That's what they're called. But these are interceptor drones to take out Russian missiles and other weapons. These are not kind of proactive offensive weapons that the UK government has been touting.
Yeah, it's a complex picture in terms of the different fronts that Ukraine is fighting on and having to defend itself on. You've got the drone war in the east around the front lines, which are largely frozen on the ground. The Russians perhaps taking a little bit of territory there. You've got the air defences, which are stretched because Ukraine simply does not have enough of the Patriot interceptors that it needs to shoot down Russian ballistic missiles that are coming into Ukrainian airspace. Then there are Russian drones, which the Ukrainians are more successful in shooting down, but they operate at different speeds and different trajectories, different range that they have in terms of how far they're able to fly, how quickly they fly. And that's why with the jet-powered drones that we're seeing Russia increasingly using now, the attacks can arrive here in a city like Kyiv much more quickly. You get the warning, you get the air raid siren, but then you can hear the explosions perhaps within a matter of seconds or up to a minute after that, whereas previously with the slower drones, the Ukrainians had much more time to get to the shelter. So you've got all these different fronts, all these different threats that the Ukrainians are facing and trying to counter. They are having some success, particularly in launching the counterattacks back into Russia, but there is still that vulnerability in terms of protecting their airspace. That's what they're really crying out for the international support for, to try to plug that gap.
And so, Alex, this statement that there will be consequences for the UK for these British-made drones being deployed by Ukraine came from the Russian embassy in the UK. So what do we know about the British response to that?
Well, I think it's fair to say it's been a fairly robust response from both the Ministry of Defence and from Andy Burnham. Of course, it's worth remembering it's not the first time there have been Russian threats directed towards the UK and others about the use of military equipment by Ukraine into Russia. And what you've heard from the Ministry of Defence and Andy Burnham is that effectively they're not going to be deterred by those threats from Russia. So you had the Prime Minister saying that he's going to continue to support Ukraine 100%. They're not fair weather friends of Ukraine, i.e. the UK isn't only there to support Ukraine when things are going in its favour or things appear to be going well. When it gets tough, the message from the Prime Minister appears to be is that they're going to continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine in the face of these threats. And that was echoed by the Ministry of Defence. And of course, it's worth remembering that one of Andy Burnham's very first phone calls when he took over as Prime Minister was to President Zelensky. He's hosted President Zelensky. He's been to Ukraine. So I think it's a very deliberate effort by the Number 10 operation to show that the support the UK has given to Ukraine up until now through various Prime Ministers isn't going to waver with Andy Burnham at the helm.
And Alex mentioned the Prime Minister talking about it today. He was on a visit to a bus depot in Wolverhampton when he said this.
This is the UK doing what it has long said it would do, which is to support Ukraine 100% against this illegal war led by Vladimir Putin. We are providing support so that Ukraine can defend itself, and that's been the British position all the way through this conflict by previous Prime Ministers. It remains the case with me. We are not fair weather friends. We will be there in Ukraine's hour of need, and that won't change.
And Alex, in terms of consequences from Russia, and we shouldn't be overly dramatic here or too speculative, but the fact is it already feels like there are some consequences in the UK from Russia.
Yeah, and this is what I mean when I say it's not the first threat from Russia, and that isn't to minimise any of this by any stretch of the imagination. But you'll remember John Healey, who is now the Chancellor, but was until not so long ago the Defence Secretary. He spoke very openly about the threats from Russia. There have been things already undertaken, like covert submarine operations that the Royal Navy said that it was tracking and tracing. That was earlier this year. So I think there is a recognition across government that the threat from Russia is real and present. And this latest threat is another example of it. You know, it isn't new, it is there. And of course, that has really formed part of the argument that we've heard, the political argument that we've heard in the UK about the need for increased defence spending, because people say there is a very real threat from Russia, and this is another tangible example of that. In terms of what form any consequences that the Russians are threatening might take, I mean, who knows? That's the kind of crucial question at the centre of all of this. But so far, the things that we have seen and that have been talked about by government are things like those covert operations, or, you know, destabilising the British democracy is something else that people talk about quite frequently. So it's not new, but of course it still matters.
And John Healey, when he was Defence Secretary, made some of those claims here in the Newscast studio when he declassified some material about the Russian submarines operating in British waters. Now, Dan, I know you've not had a chance to speak to every Ukrainian official and learn 100,000% of what's going on in the last few years yet, because you're still early on in your posting. But are you able to get a sense of how international efforts to help Ukraine are perceived in Ukraine? And what I'm really getting at is, do Ukrainians ever talk about British help in their war effort?
Yeah, they do. They're really grateful for the international support. They know how vital it has been, especially since the American backing that President Joe Biden provided was undermined or almost totally removed by Donald Trump when he took over. So they are reliant on NATO, on European nations, and they do regard the United Kingdom as one of the leading members of that. And the public response is always very warm in terms of the consistency of that support from the UK. But when you talk to some officials, maybe more quietly off the record, they will say things like, well, it's not coming quick enough. We don't get exactly what we need when we need it. Perhaps these drones that have been supplied, they're useful, but they're not exactly what we want because this war is changing and evolving so quickly and the demands are increasing and are changing technologically that the Ukrainians have had a massive success in building up their own drone building capacity and their own missiles. So they're actually saying, some officials, that actually, rather than the supply of weapons from European countries, which can take time and means that there's investment overseas in those countries, they'd rather just have the European money so they can sink that into their own defence industries, which they feel are more nimble and more responsive to the evolving, changing threats that they are facing on so many different fronts.
And I suppose, Alex, back to this theme of Russian consequences, there's a limit to what Russia could do as a consequence without it then becoming a Russia versus NATO fight.
Yeah, and of course that's been one of the key questions that's hung over this conflict from the very beginning, is where that line ends up being drawn. And it's not the first time that has clearly fed into the thinking of what support Ukraine's allies are willing to provide. So of course the conversation we're having right now is because of the use of British drones. But previously, if you think back, Adam, there were very active conversations around the use of things like Storm Shadow long-range missiles and whether that would be deemed an escalation, and whether at some point, because what the aim, that what the hope of a lot of the Western allies of Ukraine is that NATO wouldn't be drawn into a bigger conflict. And I think potentially, obviously, with Russia as well, because there's been caution over the use of some military equipment and technology for that very reason. It's been about trying to give maximum support to Ukraine without making this a Russia-NATO war. And I think, in this instance, of course, yes, we've had a Russian threat. Yes, this is another Russian threat on top of Russian threats that have come before. Britain is saying absolutely that it's undeterred by that. But I think every time that Ukraine asks for something else, part of the calculation that goes on inside the minds of defence and political leaders in the UK and elsewhere is what are the consequences of granting those requests to Ukraine, but also what are the consequences of not doing that? Because, the message very much from the UK, from Andy Burnham, from his predecessors, is that Ukraine has to win this war because Ukraine is fighting on behalf of so many others in the face of Russian aggression.
And Dan, last question to you before I let you go back inside, because I knew you stood outside in the rain. Yesterday's newscast, me and Jeremy Bowen did a sort of trot round lots of the things that the Trump administration is doing in the world, whether it's mainly the Middle East, but also we talked about the Korean Peninsula. We didn't mention Russia or Ukraine. So I just wonder, from where you're standing, does it seem like things have gone a bit quiet on the diplomatic front? I'm just thinking a year ago, there was all sorts of diplomatic activity, and it sounds like Ukraine was going to be marched to the negotiating table. All that seems to have just gone.
Absolutely, yes, totally. If you go back a year, we just had that Alaska summit that Donald Trump organised relatively early in his presidency, after he'd said that he could get this war resolved within 24 hours. Clearly, he's failed on that, and he seems to have lost interest. He's been distracted by what's happening in Iran and the other things that he's been doing. There was a rumour last week that his envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, may turn up in Kyiv within the next week or so. But I think we've had that ruled out for the foreseeable future. They have been the key figures who were leading the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, but there is absolutely no sign of those talks resuming anytime soon. What the basis for that would be, when that will come, is the big unknown that lots of people here are waiting for. And it may be that the ramping up in exchanges of fire that we've seen over the past few weeks is each side trying to build up its strength, get on the front foot so that it can be in a stronger position to negotiate on its own terms rather than having to give any ground to the other side.
Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then, Alex, returning to domestic politics, remind newscasters who Tim Montgomerie is, and then we'll talk about what's happened to him today.
Yeah, so Tim Montgomerie is a pretty prominent political commentator who's been around the Westminster scene for a number of years. He was a very notable Conservative Party supporter for a long time. He was a special advisor to Boris Johnson during Boris Johnson's premiership. He founded Conservative Home, which is like a website for kind of grassroots conservatism. But he defected to Reform UK in 2024. And at the time, he said that he thought that Reform had a certain optimism and momentum about the party. It was aligned with what he believed. Now, in recent days, he's been pretty critical of the party, and that has led us to where we are now.
Which is him being suspended from Reform.
Yeah, suspended from Reform UK because he gave a series of interviews in which he questioned aspects of the party's approach. So he was on The World at One on BBC Radio 4 on Friday after Nigel Farage won the Clacton by-election, and he effectively expressed his frustration at the tone that Nigel Farage had taken, what he called an aggrieved, angry tone. Then he also did an interview with the Spectator podcast in which he was talking about Zia Yusuf, who is Reform UK's Home Affairs spokesperson, and he was saying Zia Yusuf has to be a team player. And I think after all of that, we learnt today that he had been suspended from the party. Now, I understand that he was told, Tim Montgomerie, about that suspension before the Spectator interview came out, but it was because he'd been publicly critical of the party. It's worth saying that Tim Montgomerie isn't a front bench spokesperson for Reform UK. He's not got any official role within the party. You know, you might expect that if you think about any other political party, if you had someone signed up who was your official kind of spokesperson for justice or economy or whatever it might be, you'd kind of expect them to stick to the party line and not be overly critical out on the airwaves. Tim Montgomerie wasn't in that position. He was a Reform Party member without an official role, but he's clearly a very senior and prominent figure. And his suspension has come about in those circumstances because he kind of spoke out about aspects of the party's approach. But I understand that he's considering appealing that suspension.
Clearly, just Reform have a lower threshold for people in their tent criticising others in the tent. Because Labour and the Conservatives just had to get used to people who are in their parties going on the airwaves and being very honest about their own opinions about how things are going. And clearly Nigel Farage, just his threshold is much, much lower.
Well, it appears so from what's happened in this case, although, you know, I don't know the ins and outs of it all. I don't know if there's one specific thing that led up to this decision to suspend Tim Montgomerie's membership of Reform UK or not. But yeah, I mean, if you think about the number of times that, for example, Labour backbench MPs have been out on the airwaves criticising the party's leadership, particularly under Keir Starmer. Yeah. Or you might have Conservative councillors who are out on the airwaves, so elected officials at a local level criticising the Conservative Party. You know, that has been known to happen. In this instance, Tim Montgomerie had been critical of the party as a Reform Party member, and the party says that he was suspended in line with the party's rules on this. But yeah, it is an interesting development in Reform UK. And of course, we know that Reform UK as a party has had to scale up very, very quickly over the course of the last 18 months, 2 years or so. And how it deals with this kind of internal party management stuff is part of that.
I was listening to the Spectator podcast on 1.75 speed before I came in to chat to you.
Speedy.
And it is, well, I mean, maybe it's because I was listening to it so fast, but it is quite heady stuff from Tim Shipman. Tim Shipman is the presenter of the podcast. Yeah. Tim Montgomerie is the guest that he's speaking to, the person that we're talking about. Too Many Tims, which is actually a sketch on a Radio 4 comedy show about the BBC. But anyway, I digress. I've been doing too much listening lately. I need to just focus on the day job. So he's talking, and some of the things he says are, to understand Zia Yusuf's behaviour, you just have to understand he wants to succeed Nigel Farage. So I can see why somebody might think that's a bit disloyal. And then there's a bit where he says, there isn't a day goes by where I don't regret joining Reform. What he means is that because there's still quite a lot of growing pains in the party, he has a sort of head in hand moment most days where he's like, what's happened now? But altogether, and on 1.75 speed, that does seem like quite heady stuff. And just one other little sidebar, Tim Montgomerie was planning to launch the Reform version of the Conservative Home website, which he said was going to be called 900 Days, because that's how many days there might be until the next election. I wonder if that will go ahead now. And if there isn't a version of that, well, that would have been quite a kind of powerful tool in Reform's rise to kind of mainstream political party.
Yeah, in the way that Conservative Home became quite an influential place within the Conservative Party, then it definitely had the potential to do that. And there isn't really anything out there about Reform UK like that at the moment. So I don't know what Tim Montgomerie's plans are for that. I haven't had a chance yet to speak to him to ask him about any of that. But yeah, I think, I mean, look, he was critical of the party outwardly and openly, and he is a high-profile figure doing that. It may be that Reform UK is choosing to take this kind of quite hardline approach to its public critics for the sake of credibility and unity that it wants to portray. It may actually be that the decision to suspend Tim Montgomerie, again, because he was high-profile, leads some to question whether or not they're cracking down too hard on dissenting voices out in the airwaves. So I think it is significant because of the profile that Tim Montgomerie comes with and what this might mean for then other people in the party about whether they feel that they're able to openly question its direction.
Now, Alex, when we were in Edinburgh with Henry, I was telling the audience about how I'd bumped into him twice in one day around the corner from my house.
Henry?
Yeah, Henry Zeffman.
Yeah.
And the second time was because he was on his way to see any questions being presented by you along the road from me.
Yeah, well, you didn't come though, did you?
Well, I wasn't invited.
Oh, you're always
invited. And also
invited.
I went to see Cats instead at the theatre.
I can totally understand that.
I mean, if you'd got to me first, I obviously would have said yes.
Of course.
And also, it's the square where some friends of mine have just bought a house. So I felt all roads were leading to any questions that night. Right, Alex, good to catch up and see you soon.
See you soon.
And in the second half of this episode, we're going to talk about yet another massive court case in the US involving Meta, the parent company that owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And this one is a doozy, as they'd say in America, because it's a whole load of states, in fact, the majority of US states, going to court in California, asking for a huge amount of compensation from Meta for the damage they say the company has done to young residents of those states. The case is getting underway just as I sit down now to speak to the BBC's technology correspondent, Zoe Kleiman. Hello, Zoe.
Hi there.
I've just realised that's your old job title. You've had an upgrade.
I have had an upgrade. I'm the tech and AI editor these days.
Okay, well, we'll do tech first and then AI second, if that's okay.
No
so
problem.
This big case that's kicking off in California, basically as we're recording right now, it's starting. First of all, what do you make of the fact that it's 30 states? It's the attorneys general of 30 different states clubbing together.
I think we will end up looking back at 2026 as a bit of a year of reckoning for Meta, no matter how this works out, because it's not the first time Meta's been in court this year in the US on a big case. But this is really very significant because A, it's on the doorstep. These 30 states, 29 states, I think it is, in fact, include California, where Meta began and where it's headquartered. And secondly, between them, those states cover 2/3 of the US population. So I think it's very easy for US tech companies to rail against, nasty European legislators and nasty British legislators and nasty Australian legislators. But now it's much, much closer to home and the stakes are an awful lot higher for them.
And I was looking at the filing from the attorneys general on the California Attorney General's website, just to remind myself what this is all about, because they actually filed it in 2023, so 3 years ago, and they make a whole list of complaints. It's not just, social media is evil, discuss. They actually have a whole load of different categories of accusation against Meta.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you wanted to sum it up, what they're saying is that the company has violated both state and federal privacy laws against children over a period of time. I mean, it's like over a period of 11 or 12 years. I think it's between 2012 and 2013 and 2024 across both Facebook and Instagram. And this potentially relates to teenagers who use the platforms for, half an hour a day during that period. So it's hundreds of millions potentially of teens affected. And what they're asking for not only is financial compensation, but also very stringent changes to the platforms that kind of make them what they are. So they want to see the end of likes. They want to see the end of autoplay, of what we call doom scrolling, of that content that keeps going and going and going and keeps you there. They want all of that to be stripped out of the platforms, which, arguably makes it a very different beast, doesn't it? Because the whole point of going on social media, you could argue, is for that validation, those likes, those feelings, looking at what's popular and also seeing what else is around. It wouldn't be the same experience without them. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? Because at the heart of this as well is this idea that Meta has kept young people kind of hooked. I mean, it's being compared by some to the tobacco case, from the 90s. It's being the 80s. Sorry, it's being compared to that in terms of addiction.
And a lot of the state's evidence rests on the fact that, or the allegation, the assertion that Meta knew it was doing this and it knew that there was going to be dangerous side effects of these features.
Yeah, I mean, we should say, by the way, that Meta disagrees with all of these claims and allegations, and it says it has a long-standing commitment to supporting and protecting young people. But there is certainly suggestions, and we've heard from various whistleblowers over the years, haven't we, saying that it seems that people did know what was going on, and the rush to keep people on those platforms in order to get more and more data and make more and more money became a priority.
And I was going to do a whole little section at the end of the right of reply for Meta, but you've jumped the gun, which is admirable balance in your reporting. But when it comes to Meta doing stuff, I mean, weren't we talking earlier this year about a case in New Mexico, which is quite similar to this, that was about the addictive nature of the features on various Meta platforms, and the court found against Meta, but yet I don't see that the platforms have changed.
So the changes had to be made, but only in New Mexico. So unless you've been there lately,
why I would, and I've not been on holiday to New Mexico for a while.
You might not have noticed them elsewhere. You're right. We did talk about that, and we talked about an even bigger one as well, which was a young woman who took Meta and other companies to court. The other companies, I think, ended up settling. Meta carried on with the case, but lost that one as well. And she said that it massively adversely affected her life and her mental health. And it lost that too. So it's not having a good run of things, but it is very vigorously defending itself. It obviously does believe that it has a case, for itself, and that there is a reason why this should not go ahead. I mean, there's been an absolutely insane figure that's bandied about, that the potential cost of this, to Meta if they lose, is $1.4 trillion, which is about £1 trillion, I guess. I mean, when you're talking about numbers that big, who knows? It's about £1 trillion. Apparently, in terms of paper money, if you remember that, it's enough to wrap around the world 3 times. Anyway. This is something that is a mad figure to think about, isn't it? Meta doesn't have that kind of money. I think the entire company is valued today at about $1.5 trillion. So, what would happen in that scenario? Would it go bust? Would the state take it over? Would it become a state-run company? There's all sorts of questions about if it loses. But the other thing to bear in mind with that figure is it's like the worst case scenario. So this is every single teenager that used Instagram or Facebook over that 12-year period for half an hour a day or more, and the maximum penalty being awarded for each violation of each of those hundreds of millions of teenagers. So it's very unlikely to be a figure that size. Some people are saying, is this the end of social media? What happens if they lose and all of these features disappear and it just becomes less engaging, and then you just end up, kind of aging out of it, if you like, because people like us who've been on it for years might not leave, but nobody new will come on and it will just sort of wither on the vine. Is that the future for social media? I think Meta can't afford to let it go because it's such a treasure trove of data for them. And as we know, it's been gunning really hard for AI. What does AI need? Constant data. So the social media and the AI sides of Meta's business complement each other really well. And I don't know that it can run one without the other very easily.
Now, talking about AI, which is the other half of your new job title, I see you've written a piece on the website today about a new version of ChatGPT for teens. So a bit like the version of Instagram that exists for teenage users. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, really similar to that. So OpenAI, which runs ChatGPT, has already launched this ChatGPT for Teens product. And today it's beefing it up even more. And what I thought was really interesting about it, Adam, is that it's kind of trying to dehumanize the product, if you like. It says there'll be an option to switch off the voice so that it can't respond to you in a human voice. It's got messages reminding teens to take a break. And they say, ChatGPT is AI and it can wait. And I asked them, have you got a problem with this? Are you finding that lots of young people in particular think that they're talking to a person when they're using ChatGPT? And the firm was very quick to say, oh, no, this is preemptive. We just want to make absolutely sure that young people don't think that it's sentient in some way. But I thought that was quite interesting. But it is definitely, as you say, loosely following the model for teens that's been set by social media. And so far, certainly in the UK, there's no bespoke AI regulation. It doesn't have to do any of this. You may remember we brought in a ban for under 16s on social media that's coming in next year. And there was talk about including AI chatbots in that. And making that out of reach for young people as well under the age of 18. But the government didn't do that. And now we have a new iteration of government. So I suppose it will come up for discussion again. But OpenAI is definitely choosing to go down that road before it gets pushed, perhaps you could say. And it's also doing a lot of things that will be familiar to parents with teens on Instagram. There'll be parental alerts issued if there's a search for certain types of harmful content that get flagged, for example. You can switch it off for certain hours and it will just not become accessible for the teen holding the account. So there's lots of sort of similar little features creeping into the way in which teens use AI. And there's obviously some concern about that as well. But, as we see, as I said, maybe this is the AI sector looking at what's going on. I mean, we hear this a lot, don't we? We don't want to repeat the social media mistakes. We don't want to do that again with AI. Although we're seeing much of the same excitement and gold rush and everything else, aren't we, that we saw back then? Maybe this is an attempt at more responsibility this time around.
What I was really struck by in your piece, though, is it makes me realise this is another technology that I, because of my age, use differently from much younger people, because so much of this AI, ChatGPT teens offering is, as you mentioned, shutting it down for certain hours of the day or reminding you to take a break from it or finding ways to just sort of help you disconnect from it. But I don't need that, he says modestly, because I go to ChatGPT to do a task when I think I need it, as opposed to having it there on my shoulder like a little angel or a little devil the whole day, which makes me then realize, other people use this technology very differently from me.
I am in no way casting any aspersions here, Adam, but I know that when me and my kids compare our screen times, mine is far worse than theirs.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm talking about ChatGPT use here very specifically, not screen time, no.
No, I understand that, but the point is I use screen time generally a lot more than I thought I did, and maybe if you were to look at your ChatGPT use, it's higher than you think. I don't know. I'm not going to go there. But yes, I think it is becoming an everyday tool, isn't it? I mean, ChatGPT says that 9 out of 10 teens who use the product use it for learning. And that clearly includes homework, doesn't it? So it's introduced this thing called study mode, where it will talk you through a sort of homework style question, but not give you the answer. And that's another thing that you'll be able to activate by default for certain hours. So it may or may not help your teen to work their way through problems rather than take the easy route and just stick it in and go, what is the answer to this? And we do know that educators are very worried about students' use of AI and to what extent it's creeping into their assessments. Universities, for example, a lot of them do remote exams, don't they? Online exams. Like, who knows whether that's being boosted by AI or not? There are certainly some studies that suggest that it might be. But also, teens are using it to get advice, to get help. They're using it as a sort of form of counsellor. There's lots and lots of different ways that people are interacting with that tool, and it's more than a search engine, isn't it? It's more than. It seems to be bigger than what people would use, say, Google for. You wouldn't necessarily Google, help me sort my relationship out, would you? But you might ask a chatbot to help you with that.
Thought you said you weren't going to delve into my use of ChatGPT. Just kidding, in case any of my loved ones are listening.
Zoe, your many loved ones.
Zoe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just before we go, a quick update on that conversation I had with Alex Forsyth a few minutes ago. Tim Montgomerie, who's been kicked out of Reform, has posted a video on social media giving his response. It's about 4 minutes long. Here's the key bits. He says that he was suspended from Reform on Monday night, which now means there's a bit of discrepancy about the actual timing of when this happened. He complains that this suspension was meant to be confidential and that he didn't leak it and that Nigel Farage didn't know it was happening. He also says that I'm paraphrasing, that he's not going to go quietly. He says, you won't be able to kick me out of the party without an argument. And he says that even when he signed up to Reform a couple of years ago, he warned Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf, who was there at the time, that he would be a bit of a pain in the arse because he would tell the truth about the party. So he's suggesting that Reform knew what they were getting when he signed up. And he says that occasionally maybe he overstepped the mark, but he thinks that this is a disproportionate thing to have done to him and also to Reform's members by extension.